Okay, let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's literary Zoom lecture brought to you by Wilton Library. And a special welcome to our waitlisted guests who are watching through our YouTube live stream. I'm Michael Bellicosa, Community Engagement Manager here at the library, and I'm very pleased to be introducing this lecture, which is made possible with the support of the literary series in memory of Amy Quigley. Before we begin, a few protocol notes. Your microphones and cameras should be off, and it's important that you keep them off during the program. And also, because we have a large turnout, we'll handle the Q&A at the end as follows. You can send me your questions using the chat window, and I'll relay them to Mark after his lecture. And Mark is also happy to answer questions that you can email him directly. Our speaker, Mark Schenker, has been at Yale College since 1990 and is currently the Senior Associate Dean of the College and Dean of Academic Affairs. A former lecturer in the English department at Yale, he received his PhD from Columbia University with a concentration in 19th century and early 20th century English literature. For over 30 years, Dean Schenker has lectured on literature and film and has led book discussion series in more than 200 venues in Connecticut, including public libraries, retirement communities, museums, and cultural centers. Just this past June, Mark was with us for 4 weeks on Homer's Odyssey. And now we have a sequel, so to speak, where he will take us through Joyce's Ulysses. Please join me in welcoming back Mark Schenker. Mark.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks very much. Let me make my usual disclaimer, which is I got into teaching and book groups and discussions and even lectures in libraries for the interactiveness with my listeners, which is not going to be possible in the usual way, another COVID accommodation. So I hope, even though this is a lecture, you'll have the sense that I'm talking with you and not at you. So I was asked to give 4 lectures on Ulysses in the context of the Odyssey. And I will say that although the Odyssey is important to an understanding of the novel, it is not crucial, as many people might think. And I want to discourage you from over worrying about a one-to-one correspondence or getting involved in annotations or guides or ways to read the novel. I will tell you that Ulysses is more like other novels than it is unlike other novels. And I will tell you also that my advice to you is, if you're reading a particular section and you don't like reading it anymore, skip it. Better if you can go over it to get a sense of it without worrying about every passage. Better still, my suggestion to you, as I tell my students, and they're typically reading it for a grade, is to take a topographical approach, that is, cover the terrain, rather than a geological approach. Don't dive into. So I'm going to try to give you a sense of a topographical feel of the novel. The nature of the novel prohibits me from doing what I did when I talked about the Odyssey, which was essentially each installment covered a quarter of the epic. It's not going to work that way because of Ulysses, nor am I going to be able to explain the whole of Ulysses to you. I have taught it more than a dozen times. I'm going to guess I've read it fully maybe 3 or 4 times, and parts of it many more. I'm going to try to do what I did last September, in fact, almost a year ago to the day today, when I began a 3-part series at the Wilton Library at Michael's invitation on the 28th of September last year on how to read James Joyce. And I'm going to mention 2 of the ideas from that series before I delve into Ulysses in the context of the Odyssey. One is that an aspect of Joyce's modernism is what's come to be called symbolical realism. Human beings are partly shaped by their environment. That was a very big idea in Western culture at the end of the 19th and early 20th century. Emile Zola, Theodore Dreiser made a career out of literature that saw people determined by their naturalistic circumstances. But those circumstances include human beings' ability to make and read symbols. Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams was published in 1899, and it was translated into English in 1913 when Joyce was working on Dubliners and Portrait and inevitably Ulysses. For James Joyce, reality always includes an element of the unreal. You don't believe it? Look at the pandemic. He also believed that biology is a part of our lives, but not the whole of it. We have intestines, but we also have imaginations. So you see in Joyce this pull between depicting somebody going to the bathroom or masturbating or urinating, or quite common and sometimes even distasteful things, at the same time that it rises to the level of poetry, because that's the nature of the human sensibility. More particular to Joyce's situation as an artist, in the fifth and final chapter of Portrait, Stephen Dedalus, who's a kind of surrogate for Joyce, identifies nets that restrain him, nets about his life that keep him from flying away. Keep in mind the Icarus Dedalus image from mythology. And he identifies the nets that hold him from true artistry as nationality, language, and religion. Joyce saw each of these as limiting. Irish nationalism, because while he loved his country, its history, its people, he despised its parochialism. The language, because while he wrote in English, he knew it was the language of his people's conquerors, and that all great artists must, in one way or another, invent their own language. And religion, because while he recognized that his mind and imagination were saturated with Roman Catholic sensibility, the philosopher and writer George Santayana said that there is such a thing as a Catholic atheist. It's someone who believes there is no God and Mary is his mother. So even though he knew his mind and imagination was saturated with Roman Catholic sensibility, he knew also that the church's attitude towards sex and the body, and so much of human experience, was an assault on the broad richness of life. So later in that same chapter, the last of 5 chapters in Portrait, Stephen states that he will arm himself with silence, exile, and cunning. And here's one way to see those nets and those arms as lining up. Stephen, like Joyce, will embrace exile to transcend the nets of nationality. He will embrace silence to transcend the limits of language, and cunning to escape the restraints of religion. And so Joyce became a self-exile from Ireland, who wrote critically and intimately about nothing else but Ireland from a distance for the rest of his life. His silence is not to be understood as the absence of language, but rather a transcendence of the limits, the kind of non-language of what is hinted at, or rather expressed, rather than expressed, and what can be conveyed in myth or symbol or form rather than in statement or plot. And his cunning, like the cunning of Daedalus, the artificer who crafted the maze for the Minotaur and also the wings that were successful except for his son's recklessness. This is not the craftiness of mere deceit, but rather in the older sense of the word as skill, craftiness as related to craft, to artifice, to making. Joyce admired the mystery, the aesthetics, and the discipline of religion, but its strictures did not allow for the breadth of his worldview or his inventiveness. So I bring this all up because you might think of all of these responses as kinds of detours, how to get from here to there in a different way. And for the series, I called your attention to the line from Ulysses chapter 13, where Bloom says, longest way round is the shortest way home. That expression, that proverb, much older than Joyce in this novel, originally meant that if you have the time and patience to dedicate yourself either to a particular task or to a lifetime enterprise, a discipline, if you took the time to get it right, you would find it most efficient. Joyce leaves Ireland and writes about nothing else. He extends what language can do through parabolic means, going a longer way around. I'll give you this example. You have to remind me, Michael, am I seen by the attendant?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Okay. I take nothing for granted. I'm happy to be audible. I'm also happy to be visible.
Yep.
So a parabola, you know, is a movement of an arc like this. You get from here to there, not this way, but this way. It's a detour. It's exactly the same route as a parable. The word parable is talking about something by talking about something else, a detour. And there are all kinds of detours in the language that is going a longer way around in his method, a kind of silence because it's not direct. And he uses the language of his religious upbringing. Epiphany is the most striking instance to describe what the artistic transcendence of religious narrowness makes possible. To read Joyce well, you must be attentive to the detours. I think that's one of the most important things you can take away, which means you're often reading about something else while you think you're reading about this. And you just have to get used to that. That's Joyce's method. I'll try to make it clearer before we part company today. And so now I can turn to the relationship between Joyce's great novel and Homer's epic, which in this context may be thought of, that is the Odyssey, as a depiction of one great detour or series of detours, as the king of Ithaca is constantly delayed or thwarted or redirected, only to eventually reach his country and his people, his wife, and his son. The essence of both Ulysses and the Odyssey is going out and coming home. In Homer, the adventures of the wandering hero, while interesting as a narrative for their own sake, are seen also as tests of his courage, his craftiness, and his persistence. In this view, while Odysseus can be seen as a king, husband, and father at home, he cannot be a warrior or adventurer or true hero there. His mettle must be tested for the sake of the tale's epic values and as a way of validating Odysseus's character. That is, it makes for a good epic and it makes for a good hero. But that testing has to be done abroad. In Ulysses, there is a consistent and powerful emphasis on the value of going out, on encountering other people and situations. What both novels have in common is this expansiveness. Many characters, even though one work covers many years and the other just 24 or 28 hours, they both have this sense of being filled with the plenitude of life. So this encountering other people and situations is central to the Odyssey, because ultimately, while it's a novel about coming home, most of its time is spent on the detours. Indeed, encounter is a favorite word of Joyce's and is the title of the second story in his collection novel, Dubliner, a kind of novel made of a collection of short stories, which I enthusiastically recommend to you, published in 1914. The word encounter carries a sense of the unexpected. We don't say we encounter people we've made appointments to meet. We encounter folks and experiences randomly. And in this sense, the events of Ulysses echo the events of the Odyssey, although in a very different register. One is an epic and is earnest and old. The other is a work of irony and comedy and a celebration of the modern. Going back to the word encounter, there's also an element of confrontation or struggle in the word encounter. And the word encounter carries in its etymology the idea of meeting an adversary or a negative experience, something that is counter to what we want or expect. That's where the word comes from. An encounter is the meeting of an opposite or an adversary. No one says, I'm going out to encounter my mother later. unless you have issues with your mother, in which case we'll leave that for another time. We typically encounter a challenge rather than an opportunity. We encounter sudden illness rather than a recovery from it. And so for self-consumed Stephen Dedalus, who is the protagonist apparently of the first 3 chapters of this novel, in fact, if you came to Ulysses from having only read The Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man, where the 5 acts of that novel are completely from the point of view of Stephen, the camera is on his shoulder, you would have no reason to think that Ulysses was going to be about anybody but Stephen. The novel starts as a kind of continuation of the point of view of Portrait, and we have every reason to expect that even though Stephen might be Telemachus in the novel Ulysses, he's going to continue as the central focus. We know that's not true. Even if you've only read the first 4 chapters, we know that's not true. And so for self-consumed Stephen Dedalus, Joyce's surrogate in this novel and in Portrait, which was published in 1916, the act of encounter, of engaging with others, sometimes others we want to avoid, is indeed an act of adventure, an act of Joycean rather than Homeric courage. And I want to say there's another thing I hope you take away with you. Meeting other people in Joyce is a work of courage. It's a work of moral imagination. It's the opposite of inertia. It's the opposite of self-consumption. It's what characterizes Leopold Bloom through and through. At the end of Portrait, Stephen is asked by his friend Cranley, as he is about to leave Ireland, what was the essence of the recent argument that Stephen had with his mother? He explained that he has refused to do his Easter duty, that is, to take Holy Communion during the Easter season, despite his mother's imploring him to do so. When Cranley asked him at the end of Portrait why he won't do it, Stephen answers, "I will not serve," quite consciously echoing the words of that larger-than-life rebel, Lucifer of Milton's Paradise Lost. But before we have much time to consider whether Stephen's act of defiance has that kind of forceful and even courageous dimension, even if wrongheaded, Stephen finally admits that at the core of his defiance is fear. Fear that the communion wafer may indeed be, in Cranley's words, the body and blood of the Son of God. Stephen adds that he fears many things, and this is a quote: dogs, horses, firearms, the sea, thunderstorms, machinery, the country roads at night. You'll notice that a lot of those things have to do with loud noises, barking dogs. He's confronted by a dog in the 3rd chapter, Proteus, of the novel Ulysses. Firearms, the sea, thunderstorms, machinery, country roads at night. It's a comment on Joyce's problems with his eyes. He wore prescription lenses from the age of 6, and in his 59 years of life had well more than a dozen surgeries on his eyes. In Joyce, things are heard much more often than seen, especially if the hearer is Stephen. So that's a significant idea of how much of the imagery, so to speak, in Joyce is oral, AU, rather than visual. So Cranley asks the follow-up question after that litany of things that Stephen is fearful of. But why do you fear a bit of bread? And Stephen replies, I imagine that there is a malevolent reality behind those things I fear. I urge you to keep in mind this sentence when you think of the Stephen Dedalus of Ulysses. I'm going to read it again. I imagine that there is a malevolent reality behind those things I fear. So I was just talking about the kind of Joycean courage involved in encounters. Well, Stephen, it turns out, is not courageous, but timid, partly because he doesn't take things at their face value, but imagines another kind of reality, a malevolent one, behind the world we move in. I don't know, did I mention that he's Catholic? He has absorbed the transcendentalism of the Catholic faith. That is, he accepts completely that there's another level of reality beyond the reality that we move in. That's part of his nature. It's part of what makes him a good artist. It's part of what makes him not such a good human being. He lacks the directness of Odysseus, who doesn't look at an encounter and say, gee, I wonder what this means. He has to have the directness of a warrior and deal with the situation in front of him. So Stephen has absorbed the transcendentalism of his Catholicism, but not its message of charity and forgiveness. I recall an episode of the show Seinfeld in which George Costanza, another timorous character, another case of kind of arrested development, tells Jerry that he knows in his heart that God will never let him be successful or happy. Jerry says, I thought you didn't believe in God. And George exclaims, I do for the bad things. That's Stephen through and through. There's nothing comic about it in this novel, but there's a lot of comic dimensions to it in Portrait of an Artist as a young man, which seeks to exalt Stephen as a potential artist. That's why artist is in the title, but qualifies it by saying not quite developed as a young man. Here in this novel, he's older and he's in a completely different environment. He finds himself in a modern epic and he is not prepared to encounter. For Stephen, the default in life is not encounter, but retreat. That's another favorite word of Joyce. In the third of the early adolescent stories or the childhood stories in Dubliners, which is called Araby, many people think of it as one of the best stories in the volume. It is certainly one of the ones most frequently anthologized in other collections. The young unnamed boy who has a crush on Mangan's sister, never given a name, and who decides to go to the fair, the bazaar that is called Araby, Arabia, to get her a gift, can't bring can't bring the girl with him because she's going off on a retreat, on a Catholic retreat, of moving away from the world to contemplate spiritual life. But it's significant that in a collection of stories, well, one of them is called Encounter, the second story. The third story has a retreat in it. So Stephen is not one who encounters. He is, in fact, an anti-Odysseus, not just the son of an Odysseus in the making, like Telemachus, but a non-hero. And so in the first chapter of Ulysses, we're revealed that it takes place at 8 a.m. in the morning of June 16th, 1904. And it ends with Stephen leaving his own residence in the Martello Tower at Sandy Cove on Dublin Bay, having reluctantly given his key to Buck Mulligan, whom Stephen calls a usurper. You may have been lulled into a false sense of security in that first chapter is reasonably accessible and can be read with dialogue more or less naturally. It's called Telemachus, and it involves the young, we think, hero. So he leaves, he gives his key, he vows not to sleep there that night. He calls his housemate a usurper. The parallel to the Telemachus we encounter in the opening books of the Odyssey is decidedly an example of the mock heroic, using the epic to undercut the paucity, the poverty of modern life. So compared to the Homeric standard of a prince voyaging to seek word of his long lost father, we have here how unprincely the essentially fatherless drifter Stephen is. I want to say, and I'll be saying more about this in subsequent meetings, a great deal of the Odyssey in the opening section, where Stephen is tested and found wanting, is the Odyssey as a mock heroic. But don't misunderstand Joyce's intention. He means to celebrate the Odyssey as one of the great organizing literary works of ancient Greek life, just as he hopes that his novel will be seen as one of the great organizing literary works of modern life, early 20th century life. And he is dead serious when he casts Leopold Bloom in the 4th chapter as the wandering Odysseus. The mock epic is not as sharp and often removed. And so Joyce is very serious about the presence of the Odyssey in the novel. When I said in the beginning, it's not all that important, I meant knowing the Odyssey well will not help you much as you might think as a guide to how to read Ulysses, even though I will keep the connections in front of us. Joyce himself encountered the Odyssey at the age of 12 in the poet Charles Lamb, a 19th century figure. 1808 book of The Adventures of Ulysses, which was a redacted, abridged version for children. Lamb did the same thing for the tales of Shakespeare. They were enormously popular. Before the 19th century, there was no such thing as children's literature. There were children, I'm sure, there was literature, but there was no children's literature. If in 1750, you were a good aunt or uncle and decided to bring the child and the family a gift, and you wanted to get a children's book, all that would have been available would have been a tremor of the alphabet adorned with biblical figures. Maybe you would get Bible stories that were abridged, but you wouldn't get them in any kind of childhood format. It took the 19th century and Romanticism to discover literature for children, and Charles Lamb's Adventures of Ulysses is certainly one of those books. So he encountered it at 12, and he never stopped thinking about how he could make his own version of that masterpiece. So we see now Telemachus-Stephen as a failed version of his Homeric counterpart. He leaves his home, vows not to come back that night, has lost his key, calls the man in his place a usurper, like one of the rivals, one of the suitors in the Odyssey. We see a similar kind of retreat in Nestor, the 2nd chapter, which takes place at 10 a.m. in the morning. And the names of the chapters and the time of day were all supplied later by Joyce, who could not stop for the rest of his life talking about how clever the novel was. I give him credit for being accurate about that. He bragged that it will take professors for the rest of their lives to figure out all that's in the book. I'm not interested in finding out all that's in the book. I found plenty. So it takes place at 10 a.m. and finds Stephen teaching an ancient Greek history class at a boys' school, as Joyce did. Here, the misogynistic and anti-Semitic headmaster, Garrett DC, is far removed from the hospitable King Nestor, who welcomed Telemachus and is described by Homer as a man of sweet words. There's nothing sweet about Mr. DC, and he constantly mangles quotations from the people who said it. Moreover, he's an English sympathizer, which is never a good thing in Joyce's fiction. While Stephen does succeed in getting his salary from the tight-fisted DC, he's embarrassed to be in the pay of such a fool. And so his success on his errand is something of a Pyrrhic victory, a success that is so disastrous, in other words, as to be a failure. And that's precisely the history lesson that Stephen is teaching that day. The chapter opens with a discussion of the Pyrrhic victory in ancient Greece. What's more, when one of the less able boys in his class suggests, hopefully but erroneously, that the name Pyrrhus is related to the word peer, P-I-E-R, it's not, and then adds, in an effort to impress Stephen, that appears a kind of bridge, citing Kingstown Pier. Stephen replies, yes, a disappointed bridge. Failed encounters in Ulysses may be seen as disappointed bridges. This is because, again, Joyce believed earnestly, as Martin Buber made more articulate in spiritual terms, that all real living is meeting, that all real living is meeting. And we're going to see throughout this series of lectures and throughout your reading, the sharp contrast between a retreating Stephen, even though he's out and about on the streets of Dublin, and the other directed, the other connected common man of Leopold Bloom, who seems an unlikely Odysseus, but is the hero of Joyce's novel about true encounter. And that disappointed bridges is an image also of gaps, of disconnection. If a bridge goes out, what do you do to get from one shore to the other? You have to go around. You have to find a kind of detour. And I'm not being cute, and I'm not being simplistic, although simplicity is a good way to learn. But that image and fact of detours is central to all of Joyce's work. So the disappointment that Stephen encounters in the opening two chapters of the novel, where he's seen in decidedly social circumstances, first at home and then at work, is followed by Proteus, chapter 3. I'm sure that was a chapter many of you loved reading and maybe gave up on. Many people think of it as the hardest chapter to read and understand, and that may be true. But again, if you decide to go back to it, read it for the terrain and don't puzzle too much of each sentence or paragraph. That was Joyce's name for the third chapter, taking place at 11 a.m. and finding Stephen alone with his own stream of consciousness. So we've moved from home to work to the shore, from being with people, from being with students, from being with no one, as if Joyce is showing us how limited Stephen is as the focus of a grand novel. Here we see the self-involved young man. Stephen, like Joyce, was 22 years old in 1904, deeply ensnared in his own stream of consciousness, contemplating the nature of reality and of perception, of Jesus and of Mary, of self-identity and of self-consciousness. The section ends with Stephen having to pick his nose because he's left his handkerchief with Buck Mulligan. He decides, in the words of the novel, to lay his dry snot picked from his nostril on a ledge of rock carefully. For the rest, let look who will. So this spirit of kind of bohemian artistry, this kind of stance of artistic defiance, I did it, too bad, anyone who wants to look at it can, as if again, he's situated on a ledge for viewing. But that stance of artistic defiance is immediately given over to his worry that he's being watched by someone in this act of trivial transgression. And so immediately there's a single line paragraph that says, behind, perhaps there is someone. So even though Proteus is dense, if you focus on that last section, and possibly if you want to reread it, it's very clear that Stephen has decided in his inability to use a handkerchief to use his snot to make a statement that he's willing to let anyone see until he's not, because he's decidedly self-conscious. He has none of the courage of a true Joycean hero. So the protagonist of the coming of age novel portrait, an adequate protagonist for such a novel, is just not cut out to be or to carry the weight of Joyce's modern epic. He's insufficiently other-directed. He is too suffused with philosophical and theological abstractions to see things as they are. And he's too timid to engage in the encounters required of a Joycean hero. I want to make this point about how he's beset by philosophical, aesthetic, and theological abstractions. The symbolical naturalism that Joyce practices in his novels, where things are both what they are and what they're not, is an excellent skill to have if you're a novelist or a poet. It's not so good for a human being if that's the same way you approach the world. You may remember in The Dead, the great culminating story of Dubliners, Gabriel Conroy is at the bottom of a darkened staircase as they're about to leave the Epiphany party at his aunt's house, and he sees a woman standing halfway up the stairs, whose dress is in light and whose top is in shadow, listening to the music that's being played on the floor above. And he's transfixed by the beauty of the scene, and the narrator says that Gabriel asked himself, if he were an artist, what would he call that painting? Not a painting, but if he painted it. And he decides he would call it distant music. Well, the irony is the music that Greta is listening to is not distant. It comes from her past. It's breaking her heart. And what Joyce wants us to know is no true artist would look at such a scene and think of the caption first. That's what writers do. That's what I would do. I can't draw a line. No artist would say, what would I call that? Because Gabriel's not an artist. He is too busy with language, with literature, with discipline to have the moment actually touch him. And that's Stephen's problem as well. Now, Joyce was able in his development to move beyond the adolescence of Stephen into full-fledged artistry, but Stephen is not. And so the failure of Stephen to carry the weight of the novel is made abundantly clear in the two sentences that immediately follow the "no one's behind him watching him," and which conclude the chapter Proteus. And here are the two sentences. He turned his face over a shoulder, rear regardant, looking backward. Moving through the air, high spars of a three-master, her sails brailed up on the cross trees, homing upstream, silently moving, a silent ship. So there's that notion of silence again. Here, Stephen is presented in the language and pose of heraldry, frozen in a tableau like a backward-looking animal on an ancient coat of arms. That's not meant to be positive. The budding artist in the 20th century is cast as an immobile work of art from the Middle Ages. But what is mobile in the scene is what he sees. The schooner Rosavian, which actually was recorded as arriving in that day's shipping news. So there's the naturalism, the history, the fact of the world. There actually was such a boat going up the river that day, whose three cross trees, that is the masts, that are moving through the air recall the crucifixion of Jesus Christ on Calvary Hill. That is, there's the symbolical part. Yes, there's actually a boat. It does have three masts, and the masts actually do make us think of, or at least make the Catholic obsessed Stephen think of the crucifixion. And unlike Stephen, that boat is moving and it is homing. It's headed home. Well, we find that Stephen doesn't show up as the central character of the novel anymore. He's in the novel and he's important in several of the episodes, especially near the end. But it's no longer focused on his shoulder. The author of Ulysses discards Stephen after chapter 3 as what Buck has called an impossible person. And the novel begins again, temporarily, winding the clock back to 8 a.m. in the morning and moving to the home at 7 Eccles Street of Leopold and Molly Bloom. With Calypso, the 4th chapter, the second movement of Joyce's 3-part epic, 3 chapters about Telemachus, 12 chapters about the wanderings of Odysseus, and 3 about Penelope. With that fourth chapter, the second movement of Joyce's three-part epic is initiated in the person of the 38-year-old ad canvasser, Mr. Leopold Bloom, who becomes the great possible man of Joyce's novel. He is a man of appetite. He's a man of the particular. He's a man of commerce. He's not an artist. He is a minor businessman. He is not someone suffused with Roman Catholicism. He was born Jewish. He was born of a Jewish tradition, and his father, who emigrated from Hungary, this is Leopold I'm talking about, the fictional character. His father converted to Protestantism and changed his name from Virag to Bloom, and had his son raised as a Protestant of Jewish demographic. He is seen by people he does business with as a Jewish man, and when it serves Bloom's purpose, he lets it be known or believed that he's Jewish, but he suffers a lot of the anti-Semitism that was rampant in England and Ireland at the time. Fewer than 0.1% of the Irish population was Jewish at the turn of the century. And it's certainly part of the hardship, the suffering, like Odysseus' suffering, that Bloom has to encounter. He also lost his father when he was 20. His father killed himself by poisoning. None of these things are spoilers. You don't read Ulysses to find out how it turns out. You read Ulysses to give yourself credit for getting through it. It ends with the word yes, so be encouraged. It ends on a high note. But Leopold is wired for the world of sensation, of other people. When he says the longest way round is the shortest way home, that is fraught with several layers of meaning. He means it in the immediate sense that the street that would take him home, the main street, is so crowded with people and commerce that he will get there faster by going longer in distance, but quicker in time. So the image of a detour. But he's also painfully aware that a rival that he has is almost certainly in bed with his wife. That's not just a worry, but a fact. And that if he delays by going the long way around, it'll be better for him to avoid maybe the encounter with his rival, another suitor. But most importantly, it's Joyce's way of saying that if you want to be successful in life, if you want to get whatever home is, you need to go the longest way around. You need to read a many 100-page novel instead of just living your life. You need to spend an hour on a lovely early fall afternoon looking at me on a Zoom feed. Forgive me, I'm sorry. You need to do those things that make life richer, even though they're detours from the business of life. People who are not inclined to literary or artistic culture or museum life can't understand how someone would want to spend a beautiful day in a museum or at a symphony. Remember symphonies and museums? They just don't understand what they think of as a accommodation of sacrificing real life for the world of art, reading a book, watching an opera, attending a play. When those of us who do those things know that that's what real life includes, that the longest way around, the detours into the unreality of those experiences, is part of our reality. He is so wired for this notion of otherness, Bloom, that you'll see him often being sympathetic to characters that he doesn't know, people on the street, or even animals, in his great sympathy. So when he's feeding the cat at the beginning of chapter 4, which, like the first chapter, has the protagonist involved with breakfast milk, a key, and a feline. In the first chapter, it's a dream about a leopard. he looks down at the cat and say, they call them stupid. They understand, that is the cat, better what we say than we understand them. Cruel, her nature, curious, mice never squeal, seem to like it. Wonder what I look like to her. Height of a tower? No, she can jump. That modest question, just on the first page of my text of that chapter, wonder what I look like to her, is the kind of natural, empathetic imagination that Bloom is capable of that Stephen cannot do. Stephen cannot get out of his own way. Another instance of this is that Molly is talking from her bed to Bloom, who is making her breakfast, as he has done many, many times, and she encounters the word metempsychosis in what she's reading. And she's quite accomplished as an opera singer, but she doesn't have the advantage of the education that Bloom seems to have. And she's marked it in the book she's reading, and she wants to know what it is from Leopold. Here's the word I wanted to ask. And she says the word metempsychosis. And Bloom, hearing it but not seeing it, says, met him what? That is MET space, HIM space, what? And then she repeats metempsychosis. And he knows immediately it's the Greek theory of the transmigration of souls. But that little mistake, his mishearing, as met him what, suggests two things at once. The worry that he has that his wife is going to be meeting a him later that day, a fear that is well-founded, is always on his mind. But he's also someone who Joyce always associates with meeting, Even the idea that he feels that he has a rival in Blazes Boylan, who sleeps with his wife, is a level of humanity that Stephen's not capable of, because he himself feels constantly beaten by rivals that he walks away from. So the rest of the novel, or at least the chapters, the 12 chapters that follow in the wanderings of Odysseus, that is, until we get to the third section, the last 3 chapters, focusing on returning home to Eccleston and the great final chapter of Molly's soliloquy, are about the wanderings of a 38-year-old Jewish canvasser who is nobody important, but takes on a status and a stature that outshines Stephen Dedalus. And I'll say that that's the most important thing to keep in mind. In the Odyssey, the ultimate coming home overrides all the difficulties that have transcended it, even though we enjoy having read them. And they add, of course, much to the texture of the epic. It's the other way around in Ulysses. The encounters, the delaying, the detours are what life is about. And even though the coming home matters, it's not a successful coming home. Leopold wants to kind of emotionally adopt Stephen. He doesn't want any part of it. There's an affirmation on Molly's part that suggests that they're in a better place than they were that morning, but there's no promise for the future. It reverses the emphasis in the Odyssey, where getting home is not quite as valuable as getting out and about. So for the future, since I cannot possibly give you 3 more hours that are attached to one-by-one episodes of the book, consider that as I covered, or at least mentioned 4 chapters today, I will mention 5 next time, and then 4 or 5 in the last 2 to cover the 18. Joyce knew that the Odyssey had 24 chapters because Homer, or whoever we think is Homer, knew that that was the number of letters in the Greek alphabet. Joyce knew that the Gaelic alphabet had 18 chapters. He couldn't read Gaelic. He disavowed writing in Gaelic because he imagined correctly that if he were to write in Gaelic, he would not be a world famous author. But he knew that the Gaelic alphabet had 18 figures, letters, and so he has 18 chapters in the novel. I will try to give you the same kind of overview, and in each meeting try to suggest something like the emphasis on detours or the problem with Stephen being a transcendentalist. He's a kind of idealist, not in the sense of seeking the ideal, but involved in philosophical, religious, literary abstractions. Uh, Bloom is absolutely a materialist in not the commercial sense, but the world of appetite, the world of sympathy. He goes to a funeral, he visits a woman giving birth in a hospital, and so on. And Molly may be seen as the great sensualist of the novel, and together they make a kind of trio of experience. So I've come to the end of my time, except for questions that Michael may put to me from you. And I repeat, or for those of you who are new, if you do send me a question by email, that Michael will give you my email, I will be reasonably prompt in replying to you, even though in some instances, the answer might be, I don't know. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Mark. That was really great. Nice way to get back into the book. I was going to say to you before we started that I just started rereading it 3 or 4 days ago, and it's just wonderful. I haven't read this book in many years. So one question actually that I have, and it's a different perspective on your point of how to read Joyce or how to read this book. The second time I read Ulysses, it was many years ago, I actually read it out loud to myself. And what I found was reading it out loud and at times not worrying too much about getting everything improved my subjective feeling of understanding of what I was reading. And one example that I just thought of where you were talking about that word metempsychosis, if you read that out loud, you get the met him play on words like right away. Whereas when you read it to yourself, you might not hear it that way. What do you think about that as an approach to reading the book?
I think you should be a co-presenter of these lectures with me, Michael. This is a point I make to my college students and my adult participants all the time. Everyone knows that no matter how careful you think you are as a reader, we gloss over whole sentences and phrases. Many people see a prepositional phrase and they don't read down the street past all the stores. They just know, oh, that's street and stores. And the test of students, at least college students, not reading things is when I do a Russian novel and students who I believe have actually read the book have been reading Count Ruski, just blanking over. It's a lot of consonants and it ends in ski. They've never actually said the name of the person. I tell my readers constantly, and especially for drama and poetry, read out loud. It'll slow you down, which is good. You'll hear the music of the language, even if it's not poetic or poetry. Longest way round is the shortest way home is a beautiful, very concise package statement. And you lose the sense of voices if you're reading in your own head, because everything you read sounds like you. But if you read it out loud, you hear yourself differently from when you read in your head. That's the reason why when we hear a group of people, including ourselves, on a recording, everybody sounds right except us, because everybody sounds the way we think they sound because we hear them outside their head, but we don't hear us outside our head. So yes, now I'm aware that there may be some people in the audience rolling their eyes saying, so now I don't just have to read it, I have to read it slowly and out loud. You don't have to do anything. But if you read passages out loud, if you're able to read sections of the novel that seem particularly engaging to you, reading it out loud will help your understanding, absolutely.
And I think also it's related to another point I was going to make, that when you read it out loud, because all of the internal monologue sections are, as you've alluded to, they're all giant detours taking place constantly. And if you read it aloud, especially when those internal monologue sections are broken up by dialogue in the quote unquote real world with someone, I find you really get a sense of like your thought process in your head getting interrupted by the need to say good morning to the milkman and then going back to your daydream from 5 minutes ago. So it all fits into your overall, first of all, the aphorism about the longest way around, but also just the concept of taking these detours.
Yeah. So let me say also something that's worth keeping in mind. Ulysses is a very meta, M-E-T-A book. That is a book that is partly about its being a book. It is very hard to read very long in any part of Ulysses and not be reminded that you're reading a book. And I don't just mean because of its difficulty, although that's part of it. It does not do what many realistic novels do, which is lull you into a sense that it's a competitive reality. And when you read Dickens, you can read Dickens for hundreds of pages and forget that you're reading a novel. The same thing with Jane Austen and many other writers. Many people like contemporary fiction when it is more or less written with a beginning, middle, and an end. And they don't like it when it alters the time frame and reminds you in shifting perspectives that you're reading a book. Ulysses is constantly engaged in reminding you that you're reading a work of art. It wants to make that point to you constantly because it thinks an attentiveness to the richness of art that includes both the natural world of people, the real world of Dublin. When he was abroad, he would write to his brother, Stanislaus, to remind him, is there still the apothecary shop? Am I right that was on the corner of such and such street? And he would ask him, would it have been there in 1904? Issues like that, because it was very important to Joyce to recreate Dublin as it was, even though much of this novel has nothing to do with a travelogue of Dublin. Much of the novel, you have no idea where you are in someone's mind. And that's the interiority that is a feature of modernism. Odysseus has no interior life. It's not his fault. He was just created too soon.
Yeah. So just to wrap it up, we had a couple of comments off of our little short dialogue about reading out loud about the Bloomsday marathons that take place every year on June 16th. Yep. And someone referred to the one that's been going on since I think the early 60s at Symphony Space in New York City, which I actually went to once. So there's a very large audience interest out there in hearing the book read out loud. So, I think maybe you don't be so ambitious that you're going to read the entire thing from the first word to the last page. But as you pointed out, certain sections or certain passages that strike you, you may want to just slow down, back up a little bit, and read it out loud.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think that's, unless you got any other concluding comment, Mark, then we'll call it a success and we'll look forward to next Saturday.
Well, I will thank everyone for coming as always. And I'll also say to those in the audience who will be observing the Holy Day, I wish you an easy fast. Maybe reading more of the novel will be part of your atonement. I leave that for you to decide, but I wish you a good Holy Day. And I look forward to talking to you next week. Thank you as always, Michael, for your help.
Great. Thanks again, Mark. We'll see you next Saturday. Thanks,
Bye.
everybody. Have a nice evening, the rest of the weekend.